This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. New York Times bestselling author Tess Gerritsen's new thriller series about retired CIA operative Maggie Bird and her colleagues, the Martini Club, launched with great fanfare with the Spy Coast. In a pivot from the international locales of Bangkok and Rome in the Spy Coast, the summer guest is entirely set in Maggie's hometown of Purity, Maine. Here in this picture postcard of a vacation community is the same intense level of intrigue and spycraft that put this series on the map, as well as classic Gerritsen, a well-plotted page-turner with endearing characters you're compelled to cheer for. Award-winning and best-selling author Gerritsen has written more than 30 books that have been published in 40 countries and sold more than 40 million copies. Many of her novels have been top 3 bestsellers in the U.S. and number 1 bestsellers abroad. While on maternity leave from her work as a physician, Gerritsen began to write fiction. And in 1987, her romantic suspense novel, Call After Midnight, was published, followed by 8 more romantic thrillers. She also wrote a screenplay, Adrift, which aired as a 1993 CBS Movie of the Week starring Kate Jackson. Gerritsen made her New York Times bestseller debut with her first medical thriller, Harvest, in 1996, and went on to write many more best-selling books. Her series of police procedurals featuring Boston homicide detective Jane Rizzoli and medical examiner Maura Isles inspired the TNT hit television series Rizzoli and Isles, starring Angie Harmon and Sasha Alexander. In 2021, she co-authored with Gary Braver Choose Me, an Amazon Charts best-selling standalone thriller. Happy to have for the first time, joining me from very cold Maine, Tess Gerritsen. Welcome to this program.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, Tess, the idea for this story, where did that come from?
Well, the whole series started because of the little town I live in. I moved to Maine about 35 years ago. My husband is a doctor and he opened up a new medical practice. Part of welcoming new patients into your practice is getting an occupational history. Well, we live in a town with a lot of retirees. So they would come in and they'd say, I used to work for the government, but they could not talk about what they did for the government. After a couple of patients gave that same story, I can't talk about it. He was wondering, who are these people? Who are our neighbors? It was a real estate agent who told us they were retired CIA. We have a pretty large colony of retired, not just spies, but State Department, military intelligence. It seems to be that this is a magnet for them, partly because it's quiet. It's far from any nuclear targets. It is an intellectually rich area, and people here mind their own business.
Maggie.
So I got that idea. Yes, and that sort of launched the Spy Coast. I thought I am going to write a book about my neighbors. But it took me, 3 decades to really get old enough to understand what the issues might be for those who are retired. So it was more like these people had interesting lives. What are their lives like now? Are we still ready for adventure in our 60s and 70s and 80s?
So, Maggie Bird, for those who might be new to the series with this book, The Summer Guests, how did you create Maggie?
Maggie came to me in a voice. So a lot of my books start off because I hear a voice talking to me. And what I heard was a very tired sounding woman who said, I'm not the woman I used to be. And you hear that, that's like a prompt for an actor, like,
Hmm.
what does that mean? And you want to know, who did she used to be? So I let Maggie tell the story. And there are things you can tell about a character's voice in your head. You can tell whether they're happy or sad, whether they have an accent, how old they are, what their educational level is. And I could hear one emotion in Maggie's voice, and that was regret. So the Spy Coast is really about decisions she made during her career as an undercover spy living abroad, decisions she made that changed her life for the worst. And then she ends up in Maine in retirement and has to fall back on her friends, her little circle of spies when her past comes knocking again.
What's the secret, Tess, to creating endearing characters? Is there a secret?
I don't know. I mean, I feel as if I just try and dive into their heads and try to make them relatable to everybody. Now, we're not all spies. I mean, I'd be a terrible spy, but what I get out of getting into Maggie's head is that there's this deep humanity there. A sense of ethics that if they do something that's not quite kosher, they do it because they feel the necessity to do it. It's important for the outcome. So the number one thing about identifying with somebody is you understand their choices, and you would probably make those same choices in their place. So that's number one is to be able to identify with them. But the main thing is that you let them talk. I didn't know what Maggie's regret was until she started telling me her story. So I think that's what makes people endearing is that you can see yourself in their shoes.
Hmm. Do the characters come to you first of the story?
It varies. With Spy Coast, it was very much the characters. It was very
Hmm.
much Maggie's voice that was coming to me. And once you've painted that universe of characters, now I have my five Martini Club members. I have my police chief who is always, like fighting with them about who takes authority for an investigation. It makes the second book much easier because now I hear all their voices. Um, I think the other thing that makes them endearing, and it's something I learned actually from Rizzoli and Isles, we all want to be part of something else. We all want to have our own community. That's why Rizzoli and Isles, I think, was such a big hit on television and in the books. We all wanted to have a Rizzoli to our Isles.
Mm.
So you want that sense of friendship. And with the Spy Coast, I've just expanded that to five people, plus the police chief. And you want to be part of that club that meets for martinis and drinks whiskey and shares gossip, and because they will have your back when you need them.
Everybody loves gossip.
Yes.
Um, in terms of your writing process, you have your characters. Are you an outliner or a pantser?
I'm a pantser, totally
Mm.
pantser. Yeah, I've tried outlining. I've written this is like my 33rd book now, I think.
Mm.
And every time I tried to write an outline, it never worked. I just ended up throwing it away because a better idea would come to me. And I think that may be why it's more fun to write a book. You're not just following an outline, you're letting the story develop organically. And there were twists in the Spy Coast that I did not see coming until they happened. It's really about Maggie's marriage when she was working abroad. I did not know what happened to Danny. I got to the point in the story where I thought, oh my God, that's what happened to you. Oh, I feel so awful.
Mm.
But I just, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he going to live? Is he going to die? Those things only happen on the page at the moment I'm writing them.
Tess, what's the story behind you becoming a writer?
Oh, I think I'm like a lot of female writers anyways. I knew I was a storyteller at age 7. 7 seems to be almost a universal age for self-identifying as a storyteller.
Mm.
So I was reading a lot of Nancy Drew, and I learned to love mysteries. And I told my father, this is what I want to do. I want to be Carolyn Keene and write like Nancy Drew stories. And he said, that's no way to make a living.
Mm.
He was a very practical man, it comes from a long line of Chinese Americans. And for them, practicality and survival matter most. So I became a doctor instead. Went to medical school. I mean, I enjoy science. I enjoyed that part of it, the intellectual side of medicine, but that writing bug was always there. I would be on call, working 24 hours straight, but if I had a free moment, I'd be in my call room writing a paragraph. So I knew then I was a storyteller. I just had to wait till I went on maternity leave as a doctor. When I had the time at home, my kids were sleeping, and I would write a book that way. That's how I wrote my first book with sleeping kids.
Mm. Do you hear from fans much?
Yeah, I do. Because I do social media,
Hmm.
Facebook, X, Blue Sky. Those things are ways that people can reach out to you. And I see them on book tours. And I'm about to leave for the West Coast, or at least Arizona next week, and then I go to London, and then I go to Germany. So I do get a chance to talk to readers elsewhere and find out, what their reactions are. And it's funny, people don't really I don't think they connect to them. the plots as much as they do the relationships of these people. I mean, I hear a lot. Well, I named my daughter Mora because I want her to grow up like Mora Isles.
Mm.
Or, I named my dog Jane because I like the way that she's very stubborn. She's a bulldog. So it's the characters that people really want to talk about.
How do you come up with the names of the characters?
That's a tough one. Sometimes they're given to me because I auction off the right to name a character for a book, and the money goes to charity. For instance, the name Mora Isles was an auctioned off name. Um,
Mm.
I don't know who the real Mora Isles is, but whoever won the auction that year said, name it after my relative, Dr. Mora Isles. So there she is, and she got 13 books out of it. And sometimes in the old days, I used to look in the phone book. I'd go through the white pages and or I'd go to the obituaries. But sometimes I sit there and I will put a placeholder name and I'll just put John Doe. And I think I'll come back to that later.
What was the one book that made you want to become a writer?
You mean reading?
Hmm.
Oh, well, the Nancy Drew series, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
But I learned to really love romantic suspense when I was a teenager. Victoria Holt, all those sort of romantic suspense ones. I remember The Legend of the Seventh Virgin. For some reason, I think I read that in middle school. So it was books that were gently suspenseful. There was crime involved, but there was always a female at the center of the story. And that mattered a lot to me. As a girl, you want to identify again with your character.
Is there a person who made an impact on your reading life? A teacher, parent, librarian?
My mother,
Mm.
my mother, she was an immigrant. She did not speak English very well, but she had the Reader's Digest condensed books. And we had a whole shelf of those condensed books. And yeah, nowadays we turn our noses up. Oh, they're condensed. How good can they
Mm.
be? They were perfect for a 12-year-old. A 12-year-old maybe can't read an entire novel, but they can read a condensed book. And so that really introduced me to a lot of authors that I would later read, in full length. But I think that having books in the household was what was important. And my mom, I mean, she was I remember asking her, I think I might have been 6 years old, and I asked her how to spell grape, the word grape. She said very confidently. So it wasn't long before I realized I could not trust her. But still, she had a love of books, and she was always reading books in Chinese. But she made sure that those English books were on the shelf.
Tess, you're what? You mentioned earlier, you're 33 books in now, right? Does writing and
About there,
does it writing energize you or exhaust you?
both. It really depends where I am in the story. I think as I'm getting to the end of the book, you get energized because now you can, like the horse, they sees the stable ahead of it
Hmm.
and it starts running. So that at that stage, it's very energizing. The middle of the book is always exhausting. And the beginning of the book is always fun because it feels like the possibilities are still there before you screw up. So yeah, it's both. I mean, I think it's very much unlike art, for instance. I get this feeling that artists love what they do. They don't get exhausted. They're happy creating. For me, writing often is really hard work. It's something that you sit down and sometimes you dread getting to your desk. I'm not sure. Do painters feel that way? I have no idea.
Hmm. That's a common theme we hear here on the Speaking of Writers podcast from authors is just what you said. What is next for you in your writing after this one?
Well, I am working on the third book. It's funny. I didn't know it was a series until I finished the first book and thought I miss these people. Well, I finished The Summer Guests and I thought I miss these people. I want to see what happens next. So the third book is called The Shadow Friends, and it focuses more on Ingrid, who is one of the other members of the Martini Club. I think of her as the Hermione of the group. She's the smart one. She's always, really she can find her way out of a locked room faster than any of the men can. But we look into her history, her background, and as the book opens, her ex-lover comes back into her life. with a possible mission for her. And this is going to threaten her marriage and really throw her back into a past that she, again, like Maggie, thought she'd left behind.
Now, I know you're going out on tour. Is it hard when you're on tour to talk about, oh, it's the summer guests I'm focused on, but I'm working on the next one right now? Does it get a little confusing?
It does, because the Summer Guest I finished what a year ago, and it's past. So when people ask me specifics about the plot, I'll go, "Oh, I'm trying to remember what I wrote." Um, but luckily, because it's the same group of characters, it still feels somewhat fresh. I think the hard part about going on book tour is trying not to give spoilers because
Right.
there's so many things about the summer guest that it's a bit of a spoiler. Like the CIA, I talk about the CIA's history in Maine. We do have a bit of history here. In particular, that topic about MK Ultra, which I bring up in the story, and becomes one of the threads of the plot. But there's only so much I can say about that without revealing, the whole plot.
You can connect online with Tess Gerritsen, tessgerritsen.com. You can check upcoming book tour dates. She's on Instagram too, at tess.gerritsen, Facebook at Tess Gerritsen, also on X too, at Tess Gerritsen for more info. And the book, again, the new one coming out is The Summer Guess. Thank you so much for joining me, Tess.
Thank you.
And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast.